Innuendo, Book 5 of the Todd Mills Mystery Series. Author R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher Scribble Pub Press, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 7. There was their nightly ritual. While the water power of the mighty Mississippi had once made Minneapolis the milling capital of the world, the title, due to the advent of the gasoline-powered engine, had been lost decades earlier. A substantial share of the world's grain was still grown in the upper Midwest, of course, and the most important thing to the people who farmed the land even today was simply and absolutely one thing: the weather. So as they did every night just before 10, John and Martha Lyman sat down in their living room and turned on the television. They lived in a white 3-bedroom rambler that John's father had built some 30 years ago, when he torn down the old farmhouse that had stood for almost 70 years. They'd wanted something new, something modern, a few of the conveniences, because after all, they did live almost 100 miles west of the cities, and the land did stretch boringly flat for as far as the eye could see and the mind could imagine. And while what happened in Minneapolis and St. Paul was of little concern to those who lived out here on the plains, the weather forecast was critical, particularly now. It was mid-September, and things would start changing fast. The first snows could come any time, really. Though usually nothing stuck until after Halloween. After that, pretty much anything went. 2 years ago, the summertime high had been 105 above, while the wintertime low had been 44 below. Whew. "Don't forget, tomorrow night's the parent-teacher conference," said Martha, sipping some strawberry herbal tea as she sat down on the couch, a plaid thing done in orange and green. She was a trim, reasonably handsome woman, with shoulder-length blonde hair that she usually pulled back into a ponytail. She wore a wool sweater, and as she did most days, blue jeans. A busy woman. Her days were filled with two things: the farm and their children, two of whom still lived at home. "You're not going to be late again tomorrow, are you?" she asked, relaxing in the brown imitation leather recliner to her right. Her husband replied, "No." He'd been gone all day until just a little while ago, off doing some business. He told her it was something about a loan for a new piece of equipment. Though she didn't much like the idea of that, it had been John's grandfather's farm, and while they owed no money on the land, trying to keep this place going was more than a challenge. For over 5 years now, they'd been trapped in a cycle of horribly low prices, grisly weather, plant diseases, not to mention a bad dip in the export market. In the last 2 years alone, 6 nearby families had gone bankrupt. Glancing at her husband, she saw a big man, his skin weathered, his shoulders thick, and his jaw squared. He'd put on weight, no doubt about that, had too much of it, for sure. She still saw it in him, although the cute high school guy she'd fallen in love with, and they were still in love, and they were going to make it, right? Right. Actually, she thought sadly, staring into her tea. She was no longer sure. With each year, it seemed John had grown more distant, more preoccupied. So much so that Martha sometimes wondered if she really knew him anymore. If they weren't together, just as a matter of habit. She tried to tell herself that it was the farm, that John was simply overwhelmed with financial worries, but sometimes she couldn't help it. Couldn't help but worry that he didn't find her attractive anymore, and that perhaps he had someone else. To top it off, of all their years, of all the troubles they'd been through, this last had been the hardest to come their way. Drought and debt, blizzard and isolation, the near death of Annie, their youngest. Martha had thought they'd been through it all, but they hadn't, not until this past year. Just one day at a time, she told herself. Isn't that how you were supposed to get through these things? The kids were already in bed, and her day would last just a few minutes longer, until about 10:17, when the weather segment concluded. Hearing the all too familiar music, she blew on her hot tea, then looked at the TV screen and saw the 10 at 10 logo. And then that wonderfully familiar man said, "Good evening, and welcome to 10 at 10. I'm Tom Rivers, and we have a number of stories tonight, from a problem with the teacher's pension fund to a cancer-fighting enzyme recently discovered at the University of Minnesota. We begin tonight's coverage, however, on a very serious note, that of the murder of a young white male in South Minneapolis. "Oh, God," she muttered. It struck her immediately, of course, just the way such things had since he disappeared in the dark, practically every moment of every day since then. She'd wondered what had happened to him, just as she'd wondered how the news would finally come back. Would he call? Would he write? Would he simply come walking up the drive, his boots kicking up the dirt the way they always did, that playful grin lighting up his face? And, as she did every single time she heard any horror story, she now silently prayed, "Don't let this be about him, not about my baby, not about Andy." She was planning on getting up enough money to hire a private investigator, though she didn't actually know how to go about finding such a person. She was, however, almost positive he was there, somewhere in the cities, and ever since that horrible, horrible night, she was afraid of something like this. Afraid that one of these times she'd pick up the newspaper or turn on the television and the news was going to be about her boy. "Just over an hour ago," continued Rivers, "Minneapolis police received a call reporting the crime here. With a live report of this still developing story is our investigative reporter, Todd Mills." "Todd?" Her husband immediately set forward and started groping around for the remote control. She quickly said, "Leave it, John." "Oh, come on, we don't need this crap." He snapped back, zapping the off button. In an instant, the television screen went blank and melted into blackness. As she set forward, her hands clutching her mug of tea and fear clutching her heart. There had been no word from Andy, not since John had dragged him kicking and screaming into the barn for his 17th birthday. 3 months ago, she'd wanted so very much to send him a birthday card, a present, money, something. But where in God's name was he? "But what if," she protested, "what if it's something about Andy? What if something's happened to him?" "Then he'll have gotten exactly what he deserved, just like I said." "Jesus, Lord in heaven, how can you say that about your own son, John Lyman?" "Because he's no son of mine no more, that's how. If you had seen what I saw, Martha, you'd still be sick to your stomach, just like I am. That kid's not natural, and he's no son of mine. It's time you forgot about him. We got 2 kids now, 2 beautiful girls. That's what we got." The tears just burst out of her, and she dropped her entire mug, its handle cracking off as it hit the floor, the hot tea streaming onto the beige carpeting. Stumbling to her feet, she burst into her run and charged into the kitchen. She hated what had become of her son, and she was disgusted by the very thought of it, but now she was beginning to hate her husband too. Would they never, she thought, dropping herself on a chair at the Formica breakfast table by the back window, get past this? "Jesus Christ," cursed John, tromping into the kitchen after her and throwing the mug into the garbage beneath the sink. "You went and broke my favorite mug. Plus, you got tea all over everything, and that shit stains, you know. It stains real bad." One hand over her mouth, she stared out the window at the old silo and the 2 white metal pole barns they'd put up some years back. In the pale farmyard light, she saw his blue Ford pickup, her old Chevy, and that night came whirling back. They dropped the younger ones at her mother's for the night, left Andy at home with a friend, Geordie Weaver, and gone to town to see a movie. It was the first time they'd been out in months. But rather than stopping for a drink after the show, they'd come straight home. John was exhausted, and they'd come home over an hour earlier than they'd told Andy. She'd gone to the barn to see how that litter of new kittens was doing, and John had come in, gone straight to their own bedroom, and what did he find in their queen-size bed but the 2 of them, Andy and that Weaver kid from the other high school, both of them buck naked. John had knocked out 2 of Weaver's teeth, then dragged Andy naked and kicking and screaming into the barn, where he threw him up against a wall, stripped off his own belt, and screamed, "You little shit, I'm gonna kill you!" Oh, God. She thought she'd known her husband. She thought she'd seen every one of his dark corners. But she hadn't, not until that night. He would have killed Andy, too, would have beat him to death unless she'd come out there with the 12 gauge. Stop it! She'd screamed, firing a shot straight through the metal roof. Do you know what ungodly things they were doing? And in our bed, for Christ's sake! John had countered, his face flushed with disgust. In our very own bed. Just stop it! Then, while she'd held the shotgun on her husband, she told her oldest child to run. And run he had, charging into the house for some clothes. Next, down the dark road and into the night. He'd never returned, and the only thing they'd heard from him since was a phone call 3 days later, apologizing and saying he wouldn't be back. So, whose fault was it? Hers? His? Theirs? Was it something they'd done? Something they didn't do? Starting to cry all over again just when she thought it wasn't possible to shed another tear. She bent her head forward, and that's when it happened. The phone rang. Martha spun around on the first ring, stared right into her husband's eyes, her husband who still stood at the sink, and they both silently thought it. Who in the world would be calling this late? Clutching her stomach with her left hand, clasping her mouth with her right, she knew in her heart that this was it, the one call she'd been fearing all these months. And the tears started sliding from her eyes even as her husband picked up the phone and, in a weak voice, said, hello? Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.